All right, welcome to episode 5 of 1530. Today on air, we have our first guest with us. We have Dr. Stephanie Kowalczyk. Right now, she's working at Tennis Australia. She's a data scientist doing what we would all love to do, and that is get paid to work on tennis projects and to be immersed in tennis. And so I want to welcome her to the program, and we'll be talking about some of her work and some of the interesting findings that she's had. Dr. Kowalczyk, do you want to share a little bit more about your background and where you got started and how you led to doing tennis as a job? It's a pretty awesome job.
Sure. And thanks for having me, Ben. So my background's in statistics, and that's what I did mostly in college. And so I went through undergrad at Caltech in Pasadena, and then got interested more in the number side of science. So I was always kind of a science geek, thought I was going to do physics. But then when I learned more about how we have to try to draw conclusions from data and approaches that people use for that, I got really interested in that part of sort of the scientific process. So was lucky to get an opening at the graduate program at UCLA. So I went through their stats program, and I didn't really know what I was going to do, so I kind of just kept on going in school as far as I could. And after that was kind of looking just to do sort of a traditional track for like a biostatistician, working more in health, and really like that. But at the same time, always was a tennis fan and like sports in general. And played kind of everything I could when I was in school before I started to just focus more on the books. And once I started to know a bit more about statistics, I couldn't help but look at the game through that lens and just realizing how kind of little was changing in terms of the use of quantitative analysis in tennis.
Mm-hmm.
And I just got more curious about what one could potentially do in addressing questions that would come up in commentary and in the media. What could data actually add to those conversations? And so I started to collect data from the web and just understanding what was available and what sort of research you could do with what data was easily accessible. And it kind of took off from there. So it was really just on the side, I guess, as a lot of sports sort of nerds, stats nerds do. It starts out as a passion and a hobby, because most of us don't have these opportunities to do it full time. And so I was doing that I guess it got more hardcore probably for about 2 or 3 years after I'd finished up in grad school. And I was starting at that point to have papers just on questions in tennis and presenting at conferences. And that was how I eventually learned about this opportunity at Tennis Australia, where I am now.
Excellent. Well, yeah, we're so glad to have you, and it's an impressive background. So glad you made it to tennis as well. And like you said, you've already published a few papers and are working on some pretty cool research. So we definitely want to get into the meat of that. So the first paper that I stumbled upon was, is there a Pythagorean theorem for wins for tennis? And that was one that you'd published, and that's how I kind of ran across you and found out about that. So I want to kind of start with that topic. So I guess why did that interest you? We'll start with that, and then we'll get into more of the findings and how it is similar to baseball and what we found. So I guess what led you into that research?
Sure. So this was kind of an early one that I looked at. And I think one of the fun things about this one is that it shows potential crossover between it's almost become traditional sort of Moneyball type of sports analytics, which has largely been based in the team sports, particularly in North America. So baseball, basketball, football. Those have been the places where we've seen most of this kind of revolution in the use of numbers being advanced. And so coming from an individual sport and one where there really hasn't been that kind of dedication and interest in the stats, it was interesting to see, like, looking to what the team sports were doing in that area and whether any of that could be applicable to tennis, which is, you know, such a different sport in so many ways from any of these team sports. So the Pythagorean was one of the contributions of Bill James, and he first wrote about it in the late 80s. And the idea was, you know, could you find a way where you could set some accurate expectations for where a baseball team was likely to be at some point in the season based on their results so far? And the reason that it takes this name of the Pythagorean is that he originally proposed looking at sort of the squared ratio of a team's runs against the runs earned by their opponents against them. And that's what sort of suggested this Pythagorean relating to the relationship between the sides of a triangle. So that, you know, was kind of a well-established result in baseball. And like subsequently, there's been more sophisticated analysis than were done in the 80s to find like what is the optimal coefficient to relate runs earned versus runs allowed to long-term win expectations. So that was kind of the background. And it turns out that result, not only does it do a pretty good job in baseball, but if you look for the kind of comparable relationships with points won in other team sports like basketball, for example, you can find kind of similarly accurate projections. So it seemed like this thing that was somewhat universal across these team sports. So it kind of naturally made you wonder, like, is there any way that you could do something similar? Let's say you're interested in a tennis player's likely win percentage over a season based on, you know, let's say some months of results that they have. Could you use this method to try to get an accurate projection? And at the same time, in doing that, if you could find a relationship that would point out, let's say, what kind of measure during a match is indicative of sort of expectations going forward about that player's win ability. So it's almost like a feature selection you kind of get at the same time to find out like what's the most important thing to pay attention to in a match. So so the idea was like, okay, let's just look at what are the standard stats that are reported and try to find it. And it's what makes it interesting in tennis is that because you don't have to win every point to win the match, it kind of makes it unclear, like, well, what is the measure that you should focus on to find this Pythagorean relationship. So it means that there's just kind of more options that you have. Like it's pretty obvious that you would focus on runs in baseball because that's the definition of winning. But points isn't the definition of winning in tennis. So so that kind of adds in. But it turns out that you can find a stat among kind of the standard stats that are available in match summaries that not only does it show, does it have this predictive ability, but it turns out that it actually has a very similar relationship to runs and how they're related to these win expectations in baseball, which was really kind of crazy when you think about it. And that stat is the breakpoints one. So we all know that that's like any even casual tennis fan knows that breaks are critical to matches. In fact, most players are going to win sets based on having the edge in breakpoints won. The only exception to that is if it goes to a tiebreak, and then it's going to be decided in a tiebreak. So by and large, many matches are decided by the edge in breakpoints won, and that kind of carried over to the findings in that paper.
Right. Yeah. And I found it so fascinating too that, you know, your plus minus for wins was similar to the Moneyball run, right? Like I think it said in your paper that a typical season where you play 50 matches, your model with breakpoints could be within plus or minus 4 matches, which is pretty incredible. And I think it's also a great tool, just like for baseball, you can figure out if a player is over or maybe underperforming. I think of Dimitrov last year winning Cincinnati Masters, his maiden Masters 1000, as well as the World Tour finals at the end of the season. And he had such a good season last year. This year, not so much. And so you could use that same model to say, okay, if he played like he did last year with breakpoints, was he overperforming, winning too many matches? And this year, did he just kind of have a level dip down for breakpoints? So you can kind of see, okay, is this player lucky winning these close ones, or is the numbers really backing it up? So I think it is a great tool. Like you said, a little simplistic, similar to the baseball model, but it's still a cool result. I guess, are there any other really significant results from this research that you found interesting?
From that particular line of research, I think probably the one thing that stood out was how unpredictive first serve in was. So that's one that in commentary you'll hear talked about a lot, and there's like a real emphasis put on the first serve in percentage. But in reality, when you actually look at its relationship to a player's ability to win, it just doesn't hold up as that important for the actual win outcome, presumably because players, they kind of find the right risk balance on their first and their second serve. So the players that say have a stronger second serve can afford to take a bit more risk on the first, for example. Right. So that was one that we kind of, those of us that have been sort of looking at the numbers, like in my team here at Tennis Australia, we kind of already knew that was likely to be the case, but it's a nice one to point to as like an example that, okay, we really shouldn't be putting that much emphasis on this first serve in percentage.
Right. And that's interesting. Just like you're saying, that's one of those traditionalists. Everyone says you got to increase that first serve percentage, less pressure, less double faults. You win the point more often. And so maybe similar to Moneyball, right, where people overemphasizing maybe speed or home runs and looking less at, oh, this guy can get on base and draw walks. And so maybe that is one of those things where using data can kind of help us with our own biases. Because Stan Wawrinka, he comes to mind, his first serve percentage is pretty terrible, and the commentators always like to talk about that one. But like you're saying, his second serve is a lot stronger. So I think he has found that right balance. He's won several slams, so it's working for him. But yeah, that's an interesting result. I hadn't thought about that. Let's see here. So, and then I think we mentioned, or in the paper it talks about, so that coefficient was closer to 1.83, which is similar to baseball for the optimal coefficient. I know in basketball and others it's a little bit different. So do you want to talk about that, how it's interesting that the breaks correlate to the runs scored in baseball, and why they work out that way?
Yeah, so it turns out that coefficient, which is basically what you would raise the numerator and denominator of the metric of interest. So in the case of tennis, let's say it's breakpoints 1. In baseball, runs. It's what you raise it to. So you can optimize that thing just using linear regression analysis to find that optimal when you're just looking at like one single measure. And that's basically exactly what's been found. 1.8 turns out to be also kind of the optimal fit in a lot of analyses of the Pythagorean in baseball. And that was what I found for the relationship with breakpoints 1 in tennis. And I think the explanation that for that is that they're just on a similar scale, I think. So there's been some subsequent work to kind of show that you can find this relationship with this, I guess, why is it that these coefficients kind of come to have this ratio form? If you assume that the outcome of interest, so like runs or breakpoints, that those are Weibull distributed and independent for the player versus their opponent, or team 1 versus team 2, that it kind of falls out of assuming that distribution, a Weibull distribution for those two variables. Um, so I think then the reason is really just comes down to the fact that the number of breakpoints won is kind of a similar number you would expect as like runs that would be scored, whereas that doesn't hold up in basketball where scoring is just so much higher in general. So you would expect a much different coefficient because in a way that that coefficient reflects is almost the importance like of every additional point earned, like an additional run. What is its importance towards a match in general or a game in general in baseball? What is one additional breakpoint one? Is importance in tennis, and those are much more comparable than like one additional, say, successful shot in basketball. It has less importance just because there are so many that happen in general. So yeah, so I think it just comes down to that the kind of similar scale.
Right. Yeah, similar frequency. Yeah, I found that very fascinating that those were almost exactly the same. And so we know so this Pythagorean theory, it's more of a cool thought exercise, right? It's similar to the baseball's model, and that's kind of where they first went from with their money ball. But we know there are better metrics out there for measuring people's, I guess, clutchness, you could say, or how well they get the job done. One of them are pressure scores. Do you want to talk a little bit about pressure scores and what factors are in there? I know breakpoints are part of that. Do you want to talk about those?
Right. So traditionally in tennis, there's a lot of focus on breakpoints as sort of a measure of how players handle pressure. But we know that every point conveys some information about pressure. For example, it would be silly to say that a 30 all point doesn't also tell you something about how a player performs under pressure. So we've developed an approach that assigns a pressure value to every point in a match. So it accounts not only for the game situation, the scores within a particular game, but also where that game sits within a set, and then where that set sits within the match. Um, so every single point gets a weight effectively that represents its pressure. And that pressure measure is just a probability measure of how much losing the current point would influence the outcome of the match. So it takes more of a perspective of like, what if you were to lose? The idea being that players are more sensitive to potential losses than potential wins. So anyway, so you're essentially looking at a probabilistic influence for every point in a match. And that then gives you the ability to differentiate those points that have more influence to the outcome. And then you can put more emphasis on how a player's performing under those higher pressure, higher importance points when you're doing any kind of performance evaluation. So if I want to know not only how did a player serve overall, but how did they serve on the most important points, then I can just take this weighted average that weighs all of the service points for that player by the pressure of those points. And a lot of cool things fall out of that. So like one is just to look at the differential between the two players on any measure of interest with this pressure adjustment.
Mm-hmm.
And it turns out that if you do this, so in a typical close match, let's say a match that ends up being separated by like 6 games or less between the players, if you were to just look at the difference in the standard serve percent one, it would correctly pick the winner. So let's say you assume that, oh, the winner must have been the player that had the higher overall serve percentage. That's actually only true about like 85% of the time in close matches. And you probably, like a tennis fan that ever looks at the stats, like you, Ben, like you'll probably know that a lot of times you look there and you're like, wait a second, like this player was actually ahead, but they lost, right? You always have that kind of, this makes no sense, but it's because it ignores the variable importance of points. So when you layer in pressure and you look at, let's say, the serve pressure differential, it's going to get it right like 98% of the time.
Wow.
So it's a much stronger indicator of a player's how exactly they ended up winning, particularly in close matches where it's less about just pure ability and it comes down more to how players perform on the most critical points. So that's one of the nice things. And then another thing that you can get out of it is just compare how a player does under pressure against their own overall average. So it's just like almost a within player comparison. And that's what gets most at clutch. So if there's any way that we can try to get at a true clutch ability, a stat like that helps you to do that, because you're basically saying, does a player raise their level under pressure, or do they tend to drop just compared to, their overall average?
Yeah, that's fascinating. Any players that stood out as surprises? I know we always think of Djokovic as being pretty clutch. I assume he scored well, but any players that you were surprised to either be clutch or not very clutch in the under pressure?
Yeah, well, one that stands out. So we in the Game Insight group that I'm in here, or GIG, at Tennis Australia, we do a lot of tracking. We do metric development, like what I've described. So we're interested in putting together new stats. And then once we do that, we do a lot of studies with them, and like we track them over time. And we like to make like leaderboards and things to understand who's doing well on that measure or not. And one that stands out on this clutch measure, which I think maybe most people wouldn't necessarily assume is at the top of the list. We found consistently that Jo-Wilfried Tsonga, he always seems to end up like in our top 5 when we've looked at that over the recent years. So that's a really interesting one, because he's not the most decorated player out there, but there are, particularly if we look at like just overall serve, he does seem, when he gets into those clutch situations, he seems to kind of consistently perform well.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And then any that you were surprised that didn't do as well?
Well, I guess the one that probably there's already some suspicion of, and it would be Roger Federer. That is an area where, when he does have losses, which aren't that frequent, but when he does, it usually does come down to clutch, where it's more about kind of him beating himself necessarily than opponents beating him. So he, I think, wins. Well, what's interesting about that is that I think it tells us that he's dominated so much just based on like pure ability. So like he can get away with sometimes not always taking the most out of these clutch moments, just because his overall talent is so strong. So I guess that's an interesting one that we found.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And just like you're saying, like I think that the Anderson match against Federer in particular at Wimbledon, that was one where, pouring over the statistics, it was very puzzling. Like you said, for some matches, you're like, well, how did Federer lose? On every metric, it looks like he should have won. But like you're saying, that the under pressure, if there had just been a stat for that on the side, it would have clued us in, because Federer did have match points there. He could have closed out in straight sets, but the way the momentum went and a couple tie breaks, he ended up losing it. And it was one of the unfortunate ones where he actually won more points but lost the match. It's like you're saying, that's why tennis is such an interesting game. You can't just base it off the traditional statistics. And so I just wanted to ask you, do you think we're going to see sometime in the near future some of these more sabermetric or newer analytical ways of looking at the game part of tennis, and see maybe some of the traditional statistics that don't tell us as much, they'll be less important? Or do you think we're still a ways from a revolution in tennis with statistics?
I feel like we're really on the cusp of some exciting things. So the group here, GIG, in Australia, I think we've been putting a lot of things out there during the AO. So that's our host event, where we get to present these to audiences, and we're hoping to expand that, to other events over time. So we've been doing, in-match forecasting. We have new physical measures, like measuring the overall work players perform with their lower body in matches, and some of these pressure stats that I described. and we're providing those to the local broadcast here. And it's interesting. I've been watching, and I think we're really the first kind of that's gotten out of the gate on measures like that. And it's interesting to see during the U.S. Open, for example, the mention of like AI highlights from IBM, and I saw some I saw some predictions that were done for like who would be Nadal's, toughest upcoming opponent. And so you're starting to see that filter in a bit now. And now on the one hand, I wish we were the ones that were doing that, of course, but it's still exciting to kind of feel like, oh, it's all maybe sort of happening. And maybe, we've made some contribution to kind of encouraging other events to get on board. And so I'm happy just to see that happening, because I think it will add so much value to, how we understand the game.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. There's so much to be learned from the numbers that can tell the story there. I was looking on the ATP website. I know now, so they have a serve rating, a return rating, and a newer stat that's a couple years old is their under pressure rating. So it adds the percentage of break points converted and saved, and then how many tie breaks they're able to win and percentage of deciding sets won. So not quite the one that we were talking about, like the pressure rating, but it is a similar stat, kind of ranking their clutchness. So I think, like you're saying, we're starting to get there, but I think we still have a ways to go. So hopefully your group can help us get there. You want to talk about the really interesting research you guys are doing with the emotions, capturing the emotions of the tennis players throughout the match?
Yeah, I'd love to. So one of the areas we're really excited about is providing more numbers for, the inner game, right? This is kind of like the classic intangible in tennis is the mental side. So it's something that there's always been a lot of speculation that how players think and the kind of temperament that they have on court, that is important to their ultimate success. But it's something that we don't really have a lot of evidence to support, like what is the role that that mood or emotion has in how players perform. So most of now there are a lot of people out there that will tell you they know about mental toughness and what it means for elite athlete performance. But if you really look at what's behind that, a lot of it comes down to just opinion and anecdote. So that's one area. It's like, well, is there more that we can do to try to actually get something quantifiable? And it's a challenging problem, but one of the things that we kind of see all around us these days is the role that machine learning algorithms have in identifying objects in video from images. So there's just so much that's been advanced now in capturing events of interest from images. So we've been looking at what are the ways that we can kind of exploit those kinds of tools and models to get new information and automate the collection of information from matches, because there's all this video sitting around, but there's not a lot of it that's actually used to put into numbers that can be analyzed. So we've been working on putting some models together to try to capture facial expressions of players in matches, and then to use those expressions to try to understand, well, if, I ask 9 out of 10 people what emotion they think is being expressed, and 9 of them agree that it's mostly anxiety, then that's maybe some basis to suggest that a player's likely feeling anxiety at that moment. So we've been training models to classify different emotions, and have used them to look at some of the players that we have some expectations about their general emotional profile, because they're the most talked about players, and that gives us some way to kind of assess the face validity into the tradition alongside the traditional kind of training and testing for these types of models. And our initial work suggests that they are giving us some meaningful measures. So the idea is just continue to develop that and hopefully put it into a real-time application where we can be able to capture that emotional information during matches, which could help to further develop and improve on the models because we'll have more player data, but then to potentially start using as like a stat that can be reported during matches and add to sort of our experience of the match itself.
Wow. Yeah, that's so amazing. That sounds futuristic, but like you're saying, it's right around the corner. You guys are working on it actively. It'd be so interesting to see for players like you're saying, sometimes commentators are like, oh yeah, this player, the umpire's call or something, they feel like it was incorrect, and so they play angry and then they lose the set. But some players, I feel like maybe like Djokovic, sometimes play better when they're angry or when they're frustrated. So it'd be really interesting to see a statistic on that, to see if there's like a common trend for all players or if it just kind of depends on the player and on their emotional state. So that's super interesting. Well, it's been a pleasure having you on the show. Before we close, I want to know your picks for the U.S. Open. We've seen two rounds already, so you get a little bit of a sneak peek. You don't have to pick Simona Halep because she's already out. Who are you thinking for the men's and women's singles?
Yeah, so we did our predictions at the start of the event, which went up. I posted some on Twitter at Stats on the Tee, my tennis handle, and then we also had a piece on the Tennis Smash site, which is a Tennis Australia run kind of news site. And so on the men's side, I think Nadal, I would give the edge, just given how tough that fourth quarter ended up on the draw. Mm-hmm. So he would have been a strong favorite going in, but he definitely got help. In fact, we do a kind of assessment of sort of the difficulty of each quarter at the start of the event. And the difficulty of that fourth quarter is like the highest I've seen in probably like the 4 years or so that I've been doing this. Wow. At any slam. So that was pretty crazy. So I think, definitely Federer and Djokovic have to be bemoaning not only, the tough conditions in New York this week, but also the draw that they got. So I think I'll give Nadal the edge still, even after these two rounds. And interestingly, Halep was our pick for the ladies, but I think a lot of people were shocked by that one. So I think now that it's opened up, and before, even at the start, I mean, it was interesting that among the top 10 top picks for the women, I mean, there was so little separating the other 9 after Halep, and now like with her out, it's just like
it's wide
really,
open.
You've got to feel like it's anyone's. But it was interesting to see. I will put out one player in particular was Kiki Bertens. I mean, she was like right there at the top of the picks. So I think coming off of a really successful kind of U.S. Open series for her, I think that's an interesting potential first slam winner that's still around. So so I'll definitely be following her. And then of course you can never exclude Serena. She didn't actually end up in our top 10 picks at the start, largely because she hasn't been playing a lot. She hasn't really had to play many top players, and when she has, she hasn't performed well this year so far. Right. So I think for those reasons we're a bit pessimistic still. But Serena's done so many amazing things. I wouldn't be shocked if she defied kind of the odds on this one as well. Right.
Well, and to be fair, I also picked Halep as well, so we can all be wrong. She has played a lot of matches, so I think fatigue was a part of it. Well, thank you so much. It was a pleasure having you, Dr. Kowalczyk. She runs her blog on the Tee, and she works at Tennis Australia as a data scientist, working on the cutting edge statistics and analytics of tennis. So it was a pleasure having you, and until next time, we'll see you on the court.